All right, well, as we are continuing our Bible year journey, we are now up to the book of Esther. If you're following along with those readings, we read this book this past week, and Esther is one of the most intriguing books in the Bible. It's one of the most elegantly crafted books. And on our Christian Bible, as we're reading through, we know Esther is included with all the historical books, 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st, 2nd Kings, and on through Esther. But it's interesting that in the Jewish Bible, their version of their own scriptures, Esther isn't considered an historical book. Esther is instead included with the wisdom literature. And you have to wonder, why is that? It's in a collection with Song of Songs and Lamentations and Ecclesiastes. Well, Esther is unique among all the books of the Bible. Esther, it's not set in the Holy Land, doesn't mention Jerusalem or Judah or Israel. It's not concerned about the law or the commandments or anything that's in the Torah. The covenant is never mentioned. So we've read through all of these historical books. You'd be surprised in Esther, they don't mention Abraham and Sarah. They don't mention Isaac. They don't mention Jacob. No one talks about Moses or getting out of slavery in Egypt or the wilderness or the promised land. They don't mention David or Solomon or any of the other kings. In the book of Esther, not a single prayer is offered. We don't see a single sacrifice. There's no other acts of worship. And most surprising at all, in the entire book of Esther, God is not mentioned a single time. God doesn't appear as a character. No one talks to God, talks about God. God doesn't talk. God is completely absent from this book. Which is kind of odd, isn't it? Since it's in the Bible, right? And what's the Bible about? It's about God. And yet here we have Esther. But I think that's what makes the book of Esther so fascinating. And what makes it so brilliant. What makes it so beautiful. Because this story, which frankly belongs on an episode of Game of Thrones, is filled with odd coincidences. And is filled with these ironic reversals. And it leaves room for us to either see all of this stuff happening just because of happenstance, or with the eyes of faith, see the hidden hand of God at work. So let's take a look at how all this unfolds. The story itself is set over 100 years after the Babylonian exile. It's about this Jewish community that's living in Susa, which is at that time the capital city of the Persian Empire. And we meet the main characters of the story. This is an actual photo. And from left to right, we have Mordecai. He's Jewish, older gentleman. His cousin Esther, who he adopted when her own parents died. We have King Ahasuerus, who we assume is King Xerxes because there was never a Persian king Ahasuerus. We have Queen Vashti, who's technically not a main character but plays an important role at the beginning. And then we have Haman, who is the villain. And little known fact, he also plays Snape in Harry Potter, at least according to this photo. But we have the villain Haman. And the story begins when the king throws this elaborate banquet feast. And this isn't just like a one-night affair. This thing lasts for like 6 months, a 6-month-long banquet. He's showing off all of his wealth. And on the last day of the feast, the king he's drunk. He probably was drunk for the last 6 months. He demands that his wife, Queen Vashti, appear at the party to show off her beauty, and he commands her to wear her crown. And it appears that he doesn't intend for her to be wearing anything else at all. So the king, I told you it was Game of Thrones. And so the king's request was humiliating to Queen Vashti. And she stands up for herself and she refuses to appear, which sends the king into a drunken rage. She's railing against women who stand up to their husbands, God forbid, except God isn't mentioned. And as a result, he deposes Vashti, and then he orders that women from all 127 of his provinces, to his credit, single women from all 127 of his provinces, be brought before him so that he can choose the most beautiful as his queen. And that's when we're introduced to Esther and Mordecai. Esther's already living in the city there, and she is taken into the palace along with all of the other women because of her great beauty. And at Mordecai's direction, as she goes in, she hides her identity. She doesn't tell them that she is Jewish. And of course, to make a long story short, this is a long, drawn-out selection process that I won't get into, but Esther is chosen as the new queen. But her selection's unexpected. She's really nobody. She's really from nowhere. There's no benefit to the Persian Empire that she becomes the new queen. We're simply told that the king was in love with her and made her the new queen. But remember, no one knows her real and true identity. And then in the very next scene, Mordecai, who is working at the palace gates, happens to overhear a couple of the royal guards plotting to kill the king. And so he goes and tells Esther, who goes and tells the king. The plot is uncovered, and Mordecai gets full credit for saving the king's life, and they write it down in the official royal records. And we need to remember that. And so far we have a story, but we're not really sure where it's going or why it matters. And the story itself then goes downhill very quickly for Mordecai and for Esther, because we are introduced to our villain, Haman/Snape. Haman is not a nice person. The king elevates him to basically second in command of the kingdom, and the king demands that every time that Haman comes and goes through the palace gates, that everybody kneel down to him and bow and show him respect, except Mordecai, who everybody knows is Jewish and is out at the gates, refuses to kneel down. It's an act of defiance, and Haman's fragile ego can't stand it. And we're told Haman flew into a rage, and he said, you know what, not only am I going to kill Mordecai for refusing to kneel to me, I'm going to kill every Jew. And not just every Jew in the city, I'm going to kill every Jew in the entire kingdom. And so Haman goes to the king, and he makes this request, and the king, who probably was in his cups again, was oblivious to Haman's true motives. And he gives his consent for this decree to go out. And when it goes out and it's made public, everybody is shocked. I mean, this is just crazy. And not only that, but the Jewish people, understandably, are in despair. What's going to happen to us? Is this really going to be carried out? It's like 11 months from now, and so it's like this countdown clock until we are annihilated. Who's going to save them from this horrible fate? And so the focus goes back to Mordecai and Esther. The Jewish people know Esther's there in the palace. They know that she's the queen, and so they know that she might be their only hope. And Mordecai makes a plan for Esther to reveal her true identity to the king, to say that she's Jewish, and to ask him to reverse this decree. But Esther is reluctant. She doesn't really want to do this because there's a law that says if you go before the king without having been invited, without having been told by the king, come here, it is an act punishable by death. She doesn't want to take that risk. But Mordecai writes back to his cousin, and this is what he says in chapter 4. Don't think for 1 minute, unlike all the other Jews, that you'll come out of this alive simply because you are in the palace. In fact, if you don't speak up at this very important time, relief and rescue will appear for the Jews from another place. But you and your family will die, but who knows? Maybe it was for a moment like this that you came to be a part of the royal family. Most of our English translations use that phrase, for such a time as this, have you been elevated to this position. And this is one of those crucial moments when we think, for such a time as this, for a moment like this, is it just coincidence, or is God at work? Well, Esther finds her courage. She goes to the king at a banquet, and she says to herself before she goes, you know what, if I die, I die. And with that resolve, this ironic reversal of all of Haman's evil plans begins to happen. She speaks to the king at this banquet, and she says to him, I have a special request of you. I'd like to make it at another banquet, a special banquet, an exclusive banquet, just Haman and you and me tomorrow night. Now, Haman, ego hits a whole-time high here. Now he's rated up with an exclusive banquet with just the king and the queen. And so as Haman's leaving this banquet, again, probably not entirely sober, he sees Mordecai again in the streets, and Mordecai again refuses to kneel to him, and Haman loses his temper again. He's fuming with anger, and he orders that a giant stake be put into the ground, and he tells Mordecai the next morning, I'm going to impale you on this stake. And it looks like in the story it can't get any worse for the Jews or for Mordecai. But then the story pivots. That night, the king just happens to not be able to get to sleep, and so he calls for his servants and says, read me the royal record. I guess just for kicks, maybe to help him sleep, who knows. And the one record they just happened to read to him was about how this guy named Mordecai had saved the king's life not too long ago. And the king goes, I had forgotten about that. What did we do to reward Mordecai? And the servant said, well, nothing. We didn't reward him in any way. And he said, well, we need to right that wrong. We need to make sure Mordecai gets his due. And so he summons Haman in the middle of the night. And he says to Haman, what would the king do to really honor someone? And Haman is so full of himself, he assumes the king means to honor him. And so he says, well, if it was me, I would get this guy up and I would put a royal robe on him, and not just on a game warm jersey. I mean, this is a robe the king himself has worn, and now we're putting it on this guy you want to honor. And then put him on one of the royal horses, and then get a palace official to parade him around the streets so everybody can give him praise and adoration. And the king thinks this is the best idea ever. He says, great idea, Haman. I want you to go and do exactly that for Mordecai. And so Haman's humiliation begins. As he has to lead, he ends up being the palace official who has to lead Mordecai around. Didn't get to impale him on that stake, has to lead him around while everybody praises Mordecai. And then it goes from bad to worse for Haman, because at night Esther has this exclusive banquet with just him and the king, and the king finally is like, Esther, tell me, what is it that you request, even up to half my kingdom? And she says this, if I please the king, and if the king wishes, give me my life. That's my wish. And the lives of my people too. That's my desire, because we have been sold, I and my people, to be wiped out, killed, and destroyed. And the king can't believe this. He's like, who in the world would do this? Who is this person? Where is he? Who would dare do such a thing? And Esther says, the man who hates an enemy, this wicked Haman. Not a good moment for Haman. Not a good moment. Haman doesn't even know until that moment that Esther is Jewish. And the king is so mad, he runs out into the garden to fume, and Haman gets down on his knees and begs Esther for his life, and he comes back in, and the king assumes that Haman is trying to make a pass at Esther. And he's like, now you're taking my queen too? And then one of the servants said, you know, king, there just happens to be a stake sitting outside that's just looking for someone to be impaled upon. And the king orders Haman to be impaled on that very stake. It's an ironic, if grisly, way for Haman to go. The story concludes with the further honoring and the elevation of Mordecai. He ends up being second in command. In order to counter this decree to annihilate the Jews, a second decree is made that says the Jews should defend themselves and destroy anyone who has plotted to kill them. And there's joy and there's celebration as they're rescued. And the story ends with how Esther and Mordecai established by decree an annual 2-day feast, still celebrated today in some places, called Purim, to commemorate their deliverance from destruction. Now, for many, the book of Esther, because it's so odd, it's just out of place among all these other stories that we hear in Scripture, that it's really just a story explaining the origins of that Jewish feast, because it doesn't carry the message that the rest of the Old Testament does. We see a lot of drinking and anger, we see murder, and Mordecai and Esther are a part of all of that. They're not exemplars of covenant faithfulness. And yet, perhaps the story is even more compelling because of that. Because we have in Esther a reluctant hero. She does a great deed in the end, but she took these small, very hesitant steps to get there. She used what had been given to her. She worked within the confines of the life that was placed upon her, and she did a great thing with a whole lot of courage. And we have this for such a time as this moment when it came. And I think the message that has come down, the way this story has spoken to so many of us for so long, as we understand what that moment is like. Those times when we find ourselves at the right place and at the right time to make a difference. And there's room there to say, well, yeah, God was at work, or maybe it's just a coincidence, but whichever it is, here's a moment where I can do something. A moment comes for us to speak up or to reach out. A moment comes when we can stand by someone that others have turned their back on. Or a moment comes when we can challenge someone for doing or saying something that's uncharitable or untruthful or is unfair or lacks integrity. Or a moment comes where we have an opportunity to go an extra mile, or to give a little bit more, or to spend a little more time. There's a moment that comes, and we have an opportunity to do what's right. But often what happens, because these moments aren't always so clear, is that we hesitate. Those moments always come with risks, both big and small. We know things may not go well. It's very easy for us to begin to doubt that moment. You know, maybe this isn't one of those moments. Maybe this isn't the right time. Maybe it's better if I didn't get involved. Or where we begin to doubt ourselves. We think, well, that's not really who I am. I mean, I'm no hero. Who am I to say something? Who am I to do something? It's just not my place. How often have we said that? It's not my place. And I'm not sure when we say that, when we have those doubts, that we're completely wrong, because these moments always leave room for that. Most of us aren't heroes. Most of us are as messed up as the next person, and we can never know beyond a shadow of a doubt that this is one of those such a time moments. We could be mistaken. But here's the thing, and this comes from the rest of the testimony of Scripture. Even in the midst of those doubts, we know that God is always present. Whether we see it or not, whether we believe it or not, God is always there. And second, God always uses unexpected people. The way to guarantee that you're going to be called by God to do something significant is when you say, that's not me. I'm not able to do that. That's who God's looking for. It's kind of a built-in humility. And the last is that all moments are key moments. Frederick Buechner once wrote that there is no event so commonplace but that God is present within it, always hiddenly, always leaving you room to recognize him or not to recognize him, but all the more fascinatingly because of that, all the more compellingly and hauntingly. There's no event but God is present. And retired Bishop Will Willimon writes, in little, ordinary, unspectacular ways, the kingdom of God is being defeated or advanced through us. A battle is being lost or won on the basis of our little words, gestures, and acts. God is always present. God uses unexpected people. All moments are key moments. And so when those doubts creep in, that's when we need to look to Esther. That's when we need to find our own courage. That's when we need to have the faith to trust that God really is at work, and it's a risk that I can take to say a word or to go the extra mile, to do what needs to be done. That God is calling each of us in each of our moments to have the courage to speak and to act and to take the next faithful step, which leaves questions that only you can answer. What moment is before you even today that gives you an opportunity to make a difference? All moments are key moments. What moment is there for you? What's one courageous step, small or big, that you can take today to trust God and humbly serve others? As we come to receive this sacrament in just a few moments, I hope that you will also receive this call from God to love and to make God's love real for somebody today.